These pupils are the exception. The children of key workers, they're still allowed in school. But in less than 2 weeks' time, these classrooms will be full again, with all pupils set to return. And they're playing catch-up. And today, the government announced extra cash to help, £400 million to be targeted at the most disadvantaged who have fallen the furthest behind.
It's a positive thing. You know, we're happy about that. We need more detail.
Thamima Begum is the head teacher at Forest Gate School in East London. She welcomes the support but is concerned that it isn't enough to close the educational gap exacerbated by COVID.
Figures are showing that this pandemic has increased the gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged, and schools are a microcosm of that. So whatever we can do to reduce that gap and to level that playing field, particularly for our kind of children, we definitely need to continue to assess that, for sure, yeah.
Today's announcement will give schools in England an extra £302 million to spend on helping pupils catch up through initiatives like summer schools. Now that works out at around £22,000 per secondary school and £6,000 per primary school. And it's part of a wider £700 million package for further support, including things like holiday clubs, food programmes and one-to-one tutoring. But it's not just money that they need. With students set to return on March the 8th, these teaching centres must become COVID testing centres as well. And there is still uncertainty over how that will work.
We need to work out the logistics of the testing, the different phases of that, whether we can get them before the 8th to do some kind of the first round of tests. I hear that we can't, perhaps, so we're still figuring that out.
The Education Secretary offered some clarity at this afternoon's press conference, confirming that schools will be able to stagger pupils' return over a few days. But on whether school days could be lengthened or holidays cut short, the answer was less clear.
It's not a part of a plan in terms of lengthening school days, but as I've touched on in the past, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to see a real change, a step change in what we can deliver in terms of our schools.
For Boris Johnson, it was a case of more money, more problems, with criticism over the amount coming from the opposition benches at Prime Minister's questions.
Does the Prime Minister really believe that the 43 pence per pupil per day announced today really cuts it? And if he does, would he really be happy to see that amount spent on his own children?
The catch-up funds now amount to £2 billion. But no, he's wrong. They amount to £2 billion, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we will have to do more, because this is the biggest challenge our country faces.
That challenge will, in the end, come down to the teachers, who the unions say are already overworked and need much more support if they're to meet it.
If the government is going to say we want summer holiday clubs, then those need to be run by local authorities, and we need to get sports coaches in and music coaches in and theatre and drama. And if teachers want to volunteer and be paid for working in those clubs over their summer holidays, then that can be something that's open to them, but there should be no compulsion. We're already seeing that teachers are working above 60 hours a week. You can't ask any more of them unless they're just going to fall over. They are exhausted.
After almost a year of disrupted learning and young lives on hold, it's almost time for England's students to return to the classroom. But with mass testing, intense catch-up programmes and uncertainty around exams, it may be back to school, but it's far from back to normal.
Well, we invited the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, onto tonight's programme to tell us about his plans to help pupils who've fallen behind during the pandemic, but it was a no. Our invitation for Mr Williamson, who has never given an interview to Channel 4 News since becoming Education Secretary 19 months ago, remains open. However, a short while ago, I spoke to the former Conservative Education Secretary, Justine Greening, and began by asking her about how funds can be best targeted to address that massive gulf between rich and poor students.
It's important that we get children back into school, but obviously we don't want them in a few weeks' time after that to then just break up again. So that is time that we should be using, and we should be targeting those children that have really been the worst affected by the school's shutdown. But actually, if we do the catch-up and the recovery plan effectively, then it probably can form the basis of a longer term programme of work to close gaps. Effectively, what we're looking at the moment is how do we close these shorter term gaps that have happened because of COVID? But actually, if we can work out how we close those and then we can keep that work going, that can form the basis of how we close those gaps that were already there in the longer term. And that's the key to success, I think, in this next piece of work from the government.
So that short-term work to close the gaps, which then could form the basis of something more longer term, should that be summer schools, which are optional for teachers? Should it be lengthening the school day? What would you advocate?
A lot of disadvantaged children will lose ground over the summer. That's a well-established fact. So we're right to make sure that that especially doesn't happen this summer. I think it should be something we look at for the longer term. We've got to be quite careful that we don't just think that we can extend the school day and somehow that's the solution. This will take much more than that. We need to be looking at this broader development issue that young people have in terms of the fact they've been out of school. They don't just learn in school, it's how they learn how to socialise, it's how we make sure there's that wider personal development, that cultural capital that, again, we know on social mobility is one of the things that is a barrier for some young people, that we have plans and strategies around that for the longer term.
When you look at the figures announced today, do you have any sense that the government grasps the scale of what's needed, that they have the ambition on this?
I think everybody would accept that what we've seen today is a next step on how we deal with this terrible pandemic. But it is not, as of yet, a broader plan on how we make sure that the gaps that open up in early years, in our school years, and then the lack of advice and connections and experience that many young people have to be able to then connect them up with opportunity. Today, we haven't seen that. Of course, government doesn't have all of the answers. A lot of this lies in the hands of businesses and business getting more open. It's also in the hands, I think, of universities, and they're the social mobility engines in many respects, in many regions. So it is about government, but actually government is part of even a bigger picture than that on the goals that we need to achieve if we're going to be able to level up.
Do you have any confidence in the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, given that he's presided over the exams fiasco, the U-turn over schools reopening?
I think it's been extremely hard for both the Secretary of State and a wider DfE and ministerial team to get ahead of the curve on this pandemic. What's important now, I think, are two things. One, that we have a proper plan in place and that both young people, teachers and, of course, parents as well are confident that it's a plan that can help make sure that this pandemic doesn't have a legacy of damaging the futures of our young people. And two, that there's the resourcing, we've got the budget next week, that can enable that plan be acted upon. And the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has talked very often about doing whatever it takes, as he puts it, to make sure that people aren't losing jobs through this pandemic. We now need that same level of ambition to protect opportunities for young people in the future.
Justine Greening, thanks very much.
Thank you.